speakers. We did really everything to contain the audience of today under 1,000 people, and we succeeded. So this is a good point. And then thank you to you all for coming. I know it's very special certain circumstances. There is a lot of anxiety around. There is sometimes too much anxiety. We took here all the measures needed in terms of distance between the participants. So I see that you are a little bit everywhere in the room. That's very good. So there is should be clear, no risk, and voila. Usually we have a small cocktail at the end. This time we couldn't do that, so we just have some coffee and some water. So for the following up, I just ask you to respect the measures that are taken on a federal and cantonal level. So don't say. Yes, you can say hello, but don't touch hands. You know that. You know all these measures. I think we are all totally emerged, I would say, in this coronavirus story today. But take your distance, but really let's engage in that very interesting debate about hot topics. We started actually with a topic that was only focused on climate change. And now, for sure, we are also we will talk at the start at least about coronavirus. Why this? First, we know all that coronavirus will have a deep impact on economy and so on the struggle against climate change. And the other thing, I must say that coronavirus is a little bit the gorilla in the room. So not talking about that, knowing that the two subjects are linked, we couldn't do that. So our speakers agreed to also open the debate session with these topics. And before going right to the debate, I just would like to present our two speakers today. So on the right-hand side, your left-hand side, Richard Kozul-Wright. He is the director of the globalization and development strategies in the division of UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He has worked at the United Nations in New York, in Geneva, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge in the UK. And Richard, you publish a lot. I just went through the web. There are a lot of stuff. You published a lot, books for sure, but also for sure economical reviews, and also in general high-end newspaper, a lot of op-eds in the Financial Times, El País, Guardian, and so on. So, and you published also a UN report in 2017, I guess, where you promoted what you call the new Green Deal, or the Green Deal, which is new. So we're going to talk about that for sure. Beside of you, I have the pleasure to present Mr. Frédéric Dalsace. He's a professor of marketing and strategy at the IMD, the International Institute for Management Development, based in Lausanne, and very well known for sure. And you hold an MBA from the Harvard University School. You have a PhD from the INSEAD. The INSEAD, for those who don't know, is l'Institut Européen d'Administration des Affaires in Paris, for sure. And prior to that, you have spent 16 years as a professor in HEC Paris. And you worked with more than 40 multinationals at different stages and levels as counselor, or you were involved with companies such as Porsche, such as Lafarge-Holcim, Dassault, Renault. And you insist that you are not an economist, that you are a specialist in management first, in questions of management. And you published also, and you're publishing also in different reviews specialized in this area. So, okay, so the subject, as you read and as it's written in our invitation, says climate change. In French, I must say, I'm sorry, we will talk English. You will be able to ask your questions in French, and but we choose to privilege the English language. So the topic, climate change, the billionaires, can they save the planet? That's the idea. The first part of this debate, that will last about 1 hour, including the questions, is really centered on the question, are the two crises, the climate crisis and the coronavirus crisis, are they linked together? Are they augmenting each other, or are they neutralizing each other? So perhaps first question will be to Richard. I would just like if you can sketch us a little bit the situation, the global general impact of coronavirus on our economies, and what can you see in the next, let's say, in 2020, what kind of impact can this have? I know you just published a report from UNCTAD on the 9th of March about this question. So if you can just sketch a general view of the situation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, for that. And the report actually is, I think we left copies of the report at the back of the room for people that are interested in looking at it. Obviously, we see a fairly we are quite pessimistic about the consequences. Unlike the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which had a very specific origin in the subprime housing market, and then very quickly transversed through the financial system. This is more, the impact of the virus has been much more, if you like, on the real economy initially, and the breakdown of supply chains, the impact on consumer confidence, on investor confidence, but has quite quickly moved from there into the financial sector, and the great danger of a kind of deflationary spiral setting in is something that we are certainly very worried about. In our world, there are groups of countries, very highly indebted commodity exporters, for example, that look very vulnerable to us, to both a slowdown in demand, to a drop in commodity prices, to a strengthening of the dollar as investors get nervous and look for safer assets. The dollar-based assets are always one of the first to fly to. So there's a group of countries there that are very vulnerable. But there are, one of the great features of the last 10 years that we've tried to flag in the work that we do is the very rapid increase in corporate debt since the financial crisis. And much of that corporate debt is highly leveraged, highly fragile, and in certain sectors of the economy, aviation, tourism, that are going to be hit very hard by this crisis. We do worry that will be a transmission mechanism in many advanced economies that will seriously be hit. And if you look at a classic example now, your neighbours here, Italy, right, a country with bad banks, which is highly dependent on tourism for its 13-14% of the Italian economy is dependent on tourism, coming through years of austerity that have hit its health system very hard. A lot of old people, limited policy space because of the way in which the European Union operates. This is a country that is very vulnerable. So this is going to hit a lot of countries.
So you expect a real crash of Italy, or?
Italy is an extremely, it'll go into recession, of that there's no doubt. How hard that recession will hit, we're not sure, but it is vulnerable on very many fronts that are being exposed by this kind of health crisis.
Okay, thank you. I just allowed to mention two figures you stipulated in your report. Is the one that there could be a loss of $1,000 to $2,000 billion. Are these trillions?
$2 trillion.
$2 trillion, so it's a huge amount of money. And the growth rate could drop between 2 and 2.5%, or even lower than 2. So
I mean, that was we were in an optimistic mood at that
optimistic, point. Absolutely, I felt that in the report. Very well. Mr. Dalsace, in terms, you are a management specialist, and you were involved in crisis, I guess, with your different companies that you're counseling. Do you think this crisis was well managed, or can you tell us anything about that? Are we in economical danger? Same question than Richard, even if you haven't done the report for sure.
And I will not use the macro lens, but more micro lens. Okay. To me, and I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't know anything about disease itself. But for me, the coronavirus is a disease, but it's also a symptom and a test. So the disease we know, and thank you for the update. I think it's also a disease. It's also a symptom of what the economy is all about. Globalized economy. You have seen the supply chains completely disrupted. You also have see the state of the health systems in some countries. I think one of the reasons why the situation in Italy is so severe, the situation in many countries is so severe, is because the national health systems are on the verge of disastrous situation collapsing. And I think it's also the symptom of a tendency that we have to nationalize the debt and the problems, and to appropriate the benefits. And what we're seeing is now the NHS, and we're seeing all the governments say we're going to spend what it takes to get over the coronavirus. It's to me, on that front at least, it's the Great Recession all over again. So the firms are making huge profits. They are very powerful in times of growth and expansion. And when there is a problem, all of a sudden the countries have to take over. So that's I think the symptom of what is going on. And the test to tie into what we're going to say about climate change, I think this will be a fantastic test to see whether the companies who are looking forward, who are really trying to see climate change as one key goal, whether they're going to be resilient about that, or are they going to stop everything, say, okay, let's not talk about climate change anymore, we have to survive the next 3 months, so we stop everything that we have been doing in the past.
Interesting, yeah. In the public sphere today, actually, climate change is almost no more a topic. It's pretty incredible, I guess. Greta has vanished. We don't know where she is. We can't hear her anymore, and everybody's talking about coronavirus. At the same time, as I said at the start, the two topics are very closely linked together, and we see that there were different reports that actually the virus is a kind of antidote to climate change. Yes. And I just read before that more than many air companies have less than a third of their passengers have cancelled their flights, and there is probably even much more now. That was a little bit old already. One can see in the statistics that the pollution over China has reduced dramatically, actually. So I would like to ask you a little bit provocative question. Is the coronavirus a good antidote or tool against climate change? Who will start?
Well, I think you cannot say that, right? You cannot be happy about what is happening.
I can say it, but the question is there.
No, I think indeed there are some interesting relationships. In fact, I saw somebody who wrote that the coronavirus is going to save lives in China, because you have about 1 million lives that are being, or 1 million deaths because of the climate and the pollution issue in China. So in fact...
What do you think about that?
The problem, the issue is causal ambiguity, okay? We are sure when people die from the coronavirus that this was the cause of their death, pretty sure. And the problem is we have 1 million deaths in China every year, and we estimate, and the scientists estimate that it's because of pollution. So in one case, you have a strong causality link, and on the other hand, you have a very, very weak causality. You have causal ambiguity. So it's very difficult to compare those two things. On the other hand, I think what is interesting also is that the coronavirus may help the climate issue, trying to say, okay, now it's a good time to challenge our assumptions about growth. It's a good time to challenge our assumptions about globalization. It's a good time to challenge how firms are working. And I think this is what we need to be doing.
You're going to come back to growth itself,
yep.
and if we need it or not, or whatever. But same questions to you, Mr. Kozul-Wright. Is coronavirus something that's positive, even said with a kind of cynicism, but is it positive for climate?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's like saying, someone who's cut their ankle with a dirty knife, the first thing we should do is cut their leg off at the knee. I think that would be an extreme way of handling that kind of medical problem. For in our world, we'll get back into this, I guess, later. Developing countries, we don't want to solve the climate crisis by stopping developing countries growing. We don't think that's not the kind of policy agenda that we want to see. I think the interesting things about the parallel between the virus and climate change are just some of the assumptions. I mean, both of them are public good problems. This is a public health problem. The climate challenge is a classic kind of public good problem. It's taking place in a world where markets have been presented as private solutions to public problems has been part of the mantra of neoliberalism for the last 20 or 30 years, and we think that's failed in very blatant ways, and I think both of these problems expose that. One of the particular ways that we've tried to emphasize in the work we've done is the kind of world, the hyper-globalized world that we've seen, has become very short-termist. Meeting, quarterly or bi-quarterly goals of corporations have become a dominant way of judging whether you're successful or not. And when it comes to solving public good problems, that kind of approach for us, actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. So I think that short-termism is one. The other thing I have to say I do worry about in this case, and I think it's true of both the climate and the coronavirus, and it gets us into our next topic, is the way in which, if you like, billionaires have begun to drive the public policy agenda. So, the health agenda has been dominated in recent years by Bill Gates. Because he has the money to essentially orient the health policy, the public health policy agenda in a certain way. And I think I think we need to talk about that. I think it's a serious problem. I think climate has similar elements to it as well.
Thanks for the transition. We are going to this topic now. What's the role of the billionaires? Who should lead the measures and the battle against climate change? Is it the states? Is it the billionaires and big multinational companies? Is it the institutions, international organizations? And you mentioned Bill Gates and the fact that he's investing a lot of money in health questions. You seem critical to that, but if he had invested all his money into the production of a vaccine against coronavirus for 2-3 years ago, everybody would say, great, he did the right thing, and only private can do that. What do you think about that, Mr. Dalsace?
Unfortunately, I think you're right.
Thank you. But?
No, I think I have no personal sympathy toward billionaires. Okay, I'm sorry. It's difficult for me.
Them. I mean, you met them, you know them.
Well,
you
I don't
business.
meet them every day. And the question was, what would we do at IMD if a billionaire were to give us $500 million? And the answer is very difficult to say no, and that's the problem. Now, I have no sympathy with them because I think it's all about hubris. It's all about giving money to become immortal, I saw when coming in that the Rockefeller had given some buildings to the Geneva University. So Rockefeller is admired and is becoming a benefactor to the whole world. The truth is he was among the robber barons, like J.P. Morgan, like so many people, and who have been using a lot of less than ethical ways to make money. I don't have any sympathy for them.
Okay. But let me rebound on that. Excuse me. Let me rebound on that. Are for you all millionaires the same? I mean, is Jeff Bezos the same than Bill Gates, the same than Bernard Arnault? Yeah. Or are there different types of...
Of course, and this is very important. And I don't want to make my own evaluation of the different billionaires. Yeah. But the truth is you have Bill and Melinda Gates have been investing in health for the last 20 years. They spent more than 50 billion. And they have some results in the malaria area, in many areas. So they should be congratulated for it. But we have to be clear. Okay, let's not make them superheroes, Avengers. I agree with you that it can be very dangerous, that the fact that they can orient policies may be a problem. I don't know if you have read the 20 years report that they just published. And one thing struck me, so they were looking at the accomplishments, and there are some accomplishments. I think, Richard, you would agree with me. Yes. There are some, yeah. But one thing that was very, very problematic was at one point he is talking about UN, the World Health Organization, and NATO, and then he added with his handwriting alphabet soup, and that I cannot accept. That I find very, very disturbing because it says that he's not aware of what the institutions are doing for World Health, and he has a budget that is more important than the World Health Organization.
So, Richard, you mentioned Bill Gates. For you, Bill Gates is the same, is exposed to the same critics as Jeff Bezos, for example, which is in a different. Not different type of industry, but he has a different use of his own money. Can you compare these two things? If Gates is not the right person to do health, would Bezos be it?
Well, I mean, there are interesting parallels. I mean, 10 years ago, at the Copenhagen COP, which was a very controversial one, fell apart in the end because developing countries didn't like what developed countries were trying to do. But one of the things the developed countries promised to do was to set up a green climate fund, that by 2020, they would have put aside $100 billion to help developing countries to adapt and mitigate the climate challenge that they faced. As of now, that fund has accumulated something like $10 billion, $11 billion. A month ago, Jeff Bezos stepped in and said he was going to give $10 billion to help solve the climate crisis. Now, of course, people look at that and they think, wow, that more billionaires getting into this problem to solve this problem is what we need. But of course, the fact that governments have become so constrained in terms of their financing is actually a reflection of a world that creates people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. And so it's not the personality per se that I think we should be focusing on, or whether there are good and bad billionaires on an ethical basis. That must be the case. It's the rules of the game that have caused the kind of inequalities and indebtedness and insecurity that produces what you mentioned at the beginning of your remarks, this sense of anxiety that has now become a pervasive feature of this hyper-globalized world, and in which the climate crisis and the health crisis are symptoms of this underlying rules of the game that have constrained governments on the one hand and have allowed a very small number of people to become fabulously wealthy. You mentioned Rockefeller. Branko Milanovic, who's a scholar of inequality, a famous one, he teaches at one of the New York universities, tried to do a comparison of billionaires over time. And he picked the Roman era, which was full of very, very wealthy individuals, and he compared that with the current era. And Rockefeller, I think he did it because we do have some numbers at least for the Roman era. Rockefeller came out as a far wealthier individual than anybody in the Roman era. And Gates at that time, because he looked at Gates, and Gates was actually not as wealthy as Rockefeller, but that was in 2005 when Gates's wealth was estimated at $50 billion. It's now double that amount. And so there's no doubt that Gates has become a far more plutocratic than any, pharaoh or Roman emperor of an era that we look on and think of in horrible terms. So there's an interesting comparison between Rockefeller, Gates, and the Romans, I think, in terms of trying to understand the wealth and power that these people have.
But listening to you, one could be a little bit pessimistic, actually, because you describe a situation that originally comes from the weakness of the states. I mean, if I'm being a little bit more concrete, 2019 Madrid conference about measures to take on climate change, states are absolutely unable to agree on measures. It was the case in Paris, but now it's already vanishing again, are unable to take measures. And United States dropped out of the COP process. So, I mean, if billionaires coming up, is it not the real responsibility, the weakness of states, of our democracies?
Well, it's not just the weakness of states, it's the capture of states. There's a difference between weakness and capture. I think, the part of the problem is that states, in both state institutions at the national and the international level, or public institutions, have been captured by people with money. What the Chicago economist Luigi Zingales calls the Medici vicious circle, because wealth breeds power, as Adam Smith recognized, and if you've got economic power, that's converted into political power that reinforces your economic power. And that Medici vicious circle is something that everyone should be pessimistic about, because it is, in many respects, where our problems lie, with that capture of political institutions by the very wealthy. And I think that's, in many respects, that's where I think we need to really think hard about the kind of reform agenda that we will need to address these kinds of problems.
Mr. Dalsace, let you react.
Yeah. Here is the, again, I agree, okay? But here is the paradox. I think, indeed, these are arsonists, okay? They are arsonists. And now we are going to, they give themselves the role of firefighters. And in a way, this is not fair, right? They cannot be good firefighters because they have been part of the problem. However, and this is the paradox of the situation, I think we have to cope with this paradox. And the paradox of the situation is they are wealthy, they have a lot of money, and we can make use of this money.
How?
And we have to make use of this money with no belief. We have to make sure that this hubris and immortality that they seek is not what we are going to do with this money. So we have to take the money. I've done a lot of work on poverty in France. And I was very struck by the way, and so we developed some business models to help poor people cope with the severity of the situation in France, with firms trying to develop these business models. And what was very interesting to me was the way the poor people were saying thank you to these firms. So you had firms going at great length, developing a social business model, no loss, no dividend. So Renault would repair a car at no profit. And they were really surprised by the way these poor people were thanking them. They say, look, we have done something amazing, and they're just saying, well, thank you, bye-bye. And I think this is exactly what we should do with the billionaires. To take the money, to say thank you, but not like, oh, thank you, Bill, my hero, Jeff, my hero. I mean,
I understand that, but how do you take the money?
Meaning
that you
two ways. You have
taxes on
exactly. Well, first of all,
how do you do that?
First of all, take the money they give on a voluntary basis, and then, indeed, why is it that they want to give money freely and that they don't want to pay taxes? And there is a good book by Anand Giridharadas, The Winners Take All, is because they want credit and control. Okay, they want to be given the credit. I saved the planet because I gave 10 billion. Say Jeff Bezos, who, by the way, is emitting through Amazon 44 billion ton CO2, which is the same amount as Switzerland. And who is not paying his taxes, who is not paying his employees. So let's take his money, but without building a big statue, or we take the money. And then if we can tax them, we tax them. The problem is that we will not be able to tax them. And this is where I am a proponent of the realpolitik, is because the governments will not be able to do anything. So my take on it is more complex. We have to work with them in a different way. We have to work with firms in a different way. At IMD, we try to work with firms and to reorient them, to challenge what is, and to make sure that they see the long-term collective action that is needed.
Thank you. Richard, do you agree that the money of the billionaire should be captured by states, organizations, and redistributed in the public interest? And if yes, how do you manage that?
Well, I mean, they should pay, we should have a progressive taxation system. I mean, what we've seen over the last 20 years, both in terms of corporate tax and the taxation of high wealth individuals, is a shift from relatively progressive taxation systems that were created during and after the Second World War into relatively, and in some cases highly, regressive taxation systems. So I think most people who look at that agree that's a necessary step. Of course, I guess the point is that these people are not, including billionaires, most of them are not going to sit there and say, okay, that's fine with me, because they're going to organize them, and they have a lot of political capital to be able to resist that, and they do it constantly. On the one hand. On the other hand, it's not just a taxation problem. It's also the way in which, in a sense, they mine the state for subsidies and contracts and all kinds of things that have also undermined the capacity of states to deliver on the public policy agenda. You see, and Amazon's classic in this respect, right? I mean, if you look at the way in which Amazon, has been able to generate the kind. I mean, clearly there's certain innovations in the Amazon model. That's sure. But also they've been able to make the kind of astronomical profits they've made because of the nature of labor markets that have become highly precarious and flexible. That's allowed them to hire cheap labor on a constant basis. They've benefited from free trade agreements that have become proliferated across the world since the mid-1990s. They benefit from subsidies of one kind or another. There was the big fight in New York when Amazon announced that it was going to have a second headquarter, and how much money could they get from government. I think New York offered them $4 billion just to come there. That caused an outcry, and people resisted that. And of course, they benefit massively from tax havens. I mean, huge. I mean, if you look at where these firms claim they are making their money, they claim to be making their money not in Japan and Germany and China, which is where they do most of their business. They claim to be making their money in the Bahamas, in Switzerland, in Holland, and other places. I mean, the discrepancy is quite astounding. We did some work on that in one of the reports. Now, I guess the point for me is that all these features, labor market flexibilization, free trade agreements, mining of the government purse, these are not inevitable. These are choices and political struggles that have pushed the world in that direction. So it's not just a question of getting these people to pay more taxes. We need to change the rules of the game in a way that shifts power back towards the vast majority of the population and away from those people who have used these rules to gain not only economic wealth but political domination too.
Mr. Dalsace, can I ask you very concrete questions? Tomorrow, one of these billionaires comes to you, he wants advice, he pays you a nice amount of money for your advices. What are you going to say to him?
Well, it depends what he wants to do. It depends what he wants to do. Again, I will take the money. But the idea is that the way they use the money is uncontrolled. So I think we need to take the money and to use it in a controlled way. And I think there are institutions that needs to be put in place. The problem is that you have an institutional void in many countries. So this is what, I agree with you, Richard, but what you are talking about is not going to happen in the short term, if at all. If you see how Bernie Sanders is treated as a socialist in the US, and the only thing he's asking is a relatively modest tax on wealth, on wealthy people, and he's taxed as a socialist. So this is not going to happen. And this is where my take on it is of realpolitik. Let's work with them. Let's show them, yeah, we know what you're up to. Let's work together. And let's work together with the firms. I looked at it, the top 500 firms in the world, they have 68 million employees. These people are good people. These people, and I work with them, we work with them every day. These people are, they have children, they talk about the climate, they know that there is something to be done, and this is where I would like to go back to the virus, because there is a nice parallel to be done between stage of containment, which was where we were, stage 2 in France is how it's called, where you look at individual measures to isolate the people who have the virus. And now the new stage is not containment anymore. It's let's try to manage the situation on a global basis. And I would like to do that now. It's how can we develop coalitions of actors, including the firms, including the NGOs. So I'm talking about multi-stake partnerships. And we have some examples. We work on examples. We have documented that it exists. It can be done. Firms working with NGOs, working with local states, and doing things that were not done before. And that, I think, in the short term, is the one way to turn by 2 degrees and 4 degrees, 8 degrees, and hopefully we'll turn fast enough.
So
I'm more
slow process, actually. And may I ask if
realpolitik process.
Yeah, but in a certain way, are we not trapped in this system? I mean, the big companies are acting on the base of the money leads, they want to earn money, or they are acting on the base of pressure from states, if I take Volkswagen, they acted because they had to act, they had no other choice. But would all this trend of new cars be so strong today if there was not a financial pressure at the base? And there is financial pressure because there is political pressure. But as they themselves hold a good part of politic power, aren't we trapped in a certain way? I mean,
but there
Richard,
is
are you positive?
I think there is a light at the end of the tunnel. When you see Larry Fink saying that climate investment is good, and he says, I think, I don't want to quote his word to word, but it's something like, it's good for the physical world, but it's also good for the financial world. And I guess he cares more about the financial world than the physical world. He's saying, look, we need to harness the new problem. We need to do something because collectively, and only collectively, we can solve the problem. Otherwise, everything is going to fall down. So I think there are many signs, and this is where I say that coronavirus can be a test of that. We have many signs where things are moving little by little in the right directions. I think firms, at least we, again at IMD, we work with a lot of multinational corporations. We see that they are working honestly, earnestly on the problem, and that they want to develop these antidotes, and they want to at least do the decoupling, relative decoupling of CO2 emissions with economic growth, and the next stage, collective action to do the absolute decoupling of CO2 emission with growth.
Mm-hmm. Richard, on this question of the basic question: can today the money of billionaires, would it be enough to save the planet and work against climate change, knowing that 8 billionaires detain today the half of the wealth of the poorest part of the world population? I mean, it's huge numbers. Could, if they change minds, what you expect in a certain way, changing minds, changing their way of thinking, could they save the planet?
No, I mean, the kind of numbers we're talking about, and not us, but other people that are required to build a more sustainable and inclusive world. A kind of, and this is what we're talking about is the need for the biggest investment push in history. That's what an investment in the classical sense of the term, investment in stuff, not investment in existing assets. In whether that's in renewables or new public transport systems or different ways of organizing agriculture or the retrofitting of housing. I mean, this is real stuff that we're investing in, that we need to invest in. And we're talking about, we put it in the order of $2 to $3 trillion a year, and there's nowhere even the billionaires cannot begin to contemplate that kind of thing, which is why we argue that the real challenge, again, it's to go back to this question of the rules of the game. I agree with a lot of what's said. I think behind this is the old debate, of course, between Milton Friedman and Karl Schwab, right? I mean, this idea that the Friedman's idea that the role of the business owner is simply to make profits is the claim on Milton. And Schwab saying what we need is a stakeholder model in which businesses bring in all these different elements as part of the decision making that they undertake. Now, I mean, I find myself often when I listen to this being in the weird position of defending Milton, because what Friedman actually said was that firms should maximize their profits subject to the rules of the game. And when people present Friedman, they always forget saying subject to the rules of the game. Now, Friedman's view of the rules of the game are different from my understanding of where we are. But it's the focus on the rules of the game that I think we need to pay more attention to. And in the world we live in, and the way in which corporations operate, the rules of the game are all about finance. They're all about the financialization of the economic realm. And unless we talk about the way in which that has distorted the process of investment, and financialization has gone hand in hand with a decline in real investment. It's one of the great ironies of the hyperglobalization world. People said, we need to open up and liberalize and ensure that footloose capital can move wherever it's want, because in that world we will get more investment, because firms will be able to make the right decisions, not subject to government regulation and intrusion in their profit-making activities. And that's simply not the case. A financialized world, it turns out, is a world that's bad for real investment. And I think, for me, that's where we need really to start kind of pitching our discussion about what kind of changes we need to this highly financialized, highly speculative, highly footloose type of world, which will not deliver, whatever the good angels of these billionaires tell them, will not deliver the kind of public investment drive that we need to solve the climate crisis or indeed the health crisis that we face.
Let's switch to the third part of this debate, and the transition again is very good. I mean, if these billionaires invest in speculative stuff, and if they do so well, it's also because economists like you, I guess, are defining growth, and the base of development is always the indicator is growth rates of PIB, of GDP. So isn't there a problem in the way we are today estimating the wealth and health of an economy? Growth rate, always follow this growth rate. And this is a concept that is now put in question, actually. So what do you think? Is growth rate really still the good indicator for our economies? Perhaps first, Frédéric.
This is a very old debate. It started by Bentham in 18th century. President Sarkozy asked Stiglitz and Amartya Sen.
18th century?
Yeah.
Sarkozy?
No. Bentham, 18th century.
I know he was a king, but...
And then 2009, Sarkozy with Amartya Sen, Stiglitz, and they were trying to find some new indicators. So yes, we need to find new indicators. Yes, we have some new indicators that are taking some share of mind in the mind of many people. We have these indicators like the Human Development Index, etc. So it can be done. I think there is one thing we forgot, and this is the professor of marketing who is speaking now. I think that what needs to be done is in the mind of the consumer. And in a way, billionaires are very similar to us all. We have found the enemy, and the enemy is us. We are consumers, and we are schizophrenic. We are schizophrenic, and I think the problem of the century is schizophrenia. Because we want, as consumers, we want to pay the least amount for the best quality. As citizens, we want to make sure that everybody is paid well. As investors, when we have some money to invest, we want the best return. So, and in a way, the Bezos of the world are the same schizophrenia. They want to do good, they don't know what to do with their money, they want to be immortal, and they don't know what to do. So I think that it's not so much a new indicator that is going to change the world. It's the way the consumers are behaving. It's the way they take seriously or not the issues of sustainability, of climate change when they buy everything they buy. And I think this is where change can happen very fast, because companies are very, very focused on their customers, right? If they lose 10% of the customers, it's a big, big, big problem. We don't need to wait for 80% of the consumers to change their mind. We need a critical mass, and what we see in many countries, that critical mass is coming, and that the companies are changing. Companies are changing their behaviors because there is enough, there is a tipping point, a critical mass of consumers who say, hey, wait a minute.
And so they can't follow only the growth.
Yes.
Because of the customer.
Yes, and we've seen, Paul Polman, the ex-CEO of Unilever, he said, look, Mr. Shareholder, if you are here for 1 quarter, if you're interested in my quarterly result, I don't want you as my shareholder. Okay, go away. That's what he said. And we're seeing this more and more. People will say, look, we want to develop a new model, and we're going to get there little by little.
Okay, new model. Richard, you were talking about the Green New Deal. What does it mean, and what's your idea of change, actually? Always in the perspective of saving the planet or struggling against the climate change.
Well, let me just start with pulling up the people before I get to saving the planet. If you are living paycheck to paycheck, which is true of a lot of people in this world, more than half of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. If you were not able to afford a $500 emergency payment of some kind, then of course you worry about the price of the stuff that you pay. And if the price of the stuff you pay is cheaper, you're happy about that. But the problem is that these people are not being paid enough. I mean, I don't see any billionaires agitating even for a decent minimum wage, let alone unionization of their plants, because we know that the best way to deal with problems of inequality and substandard wages is trade unions. Historically, I mean, the correlation is almost complete. And I don't see any of these people. I don't see Bill Gates on picket lines, supporting people who want to organize unions in Amazon warehouses. I have never seen that, and I suspect I never will. Because they don't want that kind of change. But I think the kind of collective, the kind of notions of solidarity that we need to address both the inequality problem and the climate challenge are different from the way in which billionaires look at the world. Even those who have very good intentions, I think they look at the world in a very different way. And for me at least, to me the way to handle these problems is through democratic government. And ultimately anything that makes the life of a democratic government difficult is a problem for me. And I think, as I said before, the rules of the game as they are currently constructed make the lives of democratic governments very difficult. And unless we address that in terms of both in terms of the revenues that they can generate to pay for public goods, and in terms of the policy space available to make the trade-offs and manage the conflicting interests, which is part of everyday capitalist life, clearly. And until we solve those problems, I think the question of the intention and the morality of firms is a secondary issue. And it's about really addressing those rules of the game that I think is the way to think about solving the climate challenge. And we argue, for example, that we've argued that the money is out. I mean, people say when we say, oh, global Green New Deal sounds overly ambitious, trillions of dollars. The money is out there. You know, the financial system on an annual basis generates something in the order of $5 trillion in new credit each year. The problem is that new credit is going essentially, is creating this revolving wheel. It's a distribution problem, exactly. It's a distribution problem,
Frédéric,
not just a growth issue.
On this.
No, I very much agree with Richard. The only problem is this is not going to happen. The change of the rules, I don't see that happening. So I think we have to be pragmatic and take the world as it is, not as you want it to be, as we want it to be.
So
very
what's your
much.
next step in your concept?
Sorry?
What should be the next step in your
Again,
concept?
I think step-by-step change, multi-stake partnerships, the way the firms are moving now is a path in the right direction. This should be encouraged. This should be promoted. We are working with firms and they say, look, how can we make progress in the sustainability? How can we make
and
sure...
they are sincere, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've just been working with
No
Atlas
greenwashing.
Copco in Stockholm. These guys were going to develop a program because they really want to develop new products that will be less CO2 intensive. They want to make sure that they have an impact on the lives of the people they touch. I think this is happening. Not fast enough? Yes. Not dramatic? Yes. But at least something is happening.
Okay. One thing there's a lot of talk about in the ecologist side, at least, is degrowth. It was already a topic, Club of Rome, 1972, the report, Mission report. Is degrowth a solution for less pollution and a healthier planet? Perhaps Richard.
Well, certainly not for our constituency. You're not going to go into a room and offer a solution to the climate problem to developing countries by saying you ain't going to grow for the next 25 years. That's clear. So now, whether there is a case for the people have tried to present a different way of thinking about what is a circular economy that doesn't get into the degrowth debate, because people see it as polarizing. But certainly for most of our constituency, that would be a political non-starter. So the question is, how do you achieve growth at the same time as you begin to decarbonize, and not only begin, but to do that at a rate? The science is clear here, right? If we do not really tackle this problem in the next decade, then we're sure to go above 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperature. And the damage of going above 2 degrees is in the hundreds of trillions of dollars, as people, trying to model all the difficulties of modeling this exercise. So the costs of not doing this are huge. So I don't think we can. There's not an increment from our point of view in that sense. There's not an incremental solution to this problem. If we take the science of climate change seriously, then there cannot be incremental. There's not an incremental solution to this problem. There has to be a very large-scale, publicly managed and organized response to changing the way in which we go about, as you said, producing and consuming the things that we need and that we want. And I understand that you look at the current state of politicians in the 21st, and it's not an exactly encouraging picture in terms of the kind of people that we see that ultimately have to take these decisions. I agree with that, but I don't think there's an incremental solution in which corporations do things better than they were doing 20 years ago that will get us anywhere close to the kind of commitments that we need to address the climate challenge.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Frédéric. I think we are running a little bit late, but
Pierre, can I say something on degrowth?
Okay,
if I
one
may?
word, and we go to the
one
audience.
word. Sorry
Really.
to. I think what is important is to realize that the developing, emerging economies, the way you want to call them, they cannot degrowth. That's pretty sure. But and the problem is that they have to invent new ways to live. If the rate of cars in the US per 1,000 inhabitants is 875, okay, that means that if an Indian people wanted to live like an American, you would have 1 billion cars on the roads in India, okay? So India would be just a big parking lot because you don't move. And the CO2 emission would go to the roof. So we have to innovate. And who is going to innovate? You talk about science, Richard, yes, but then from science you go to innovation, you go to the firms that are really the cogs to make this innovation possible, to make transportation more sustainable, to make sure that these people can transport. Because you cannot just say to them, "Oh, sorry, but you're not going to move, you're not going to have mobility because we cannot provide the kind of mobility we have in the US."
Thank you. Let's go to the audience. Are there questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yes.
Just tell your name and organization.
Of course.
Please.
Derek Coyne, Calper from the Quanalytics Impact Platform. Thank you so much for this dialogue. I had two questions regarding rules of the game and then actually how to maybe have an impact. The first question is about actually the current system, which is really based on the Westphalian structure of nation states, which is, I would say, really aligned to a geographically centric world. But over the last 30 years, we've had actually the emergence of digitalization, which is really actually going through boundaries and physical boundaries. And what we're experiencing now actually through the COVID-19, climate change, it's really actually those type of, I would say, global commons, which go beyond boundaries. So is that Westphalian structure still the right, I would say, premise for rules of the game? My second question is regarding impact, and if we look actually at incentives, it seems today profits is the key incentives for whoever wants to invest or get dividend or want to get some capital protection. So I wanted to have your views on impact investing, where suddenly actually you don't only focus on financial profits, but you also focus on social and environmental impact. Could that be crafted in a way that then traditional capital can maybe actually address those impact challenges? And maybe one dimension which you hadn't mentioned is actually the current low or negative yield environment, because those $5 trillion need to have returns. So it could be a humongous opportunity actually to just say, look, we have alternative investment opportunities providing financial returns with some added social and environmental impact, which provide some returns. So suddenly actually traditional investors would be considering, like BlackRock and Mr. Fink, as you mentioned earlier, might be considering new ways to allocate capital. So it's really rules of the game and linked to the Westphalian, and then actually how profits can actually be the incentive to reallocate capital. Thank you.
Who wants to answer? Perhaps Richard first. Try to be short. We have more questions.
As a believer in the nations, I think the nation state is one of the great human inventions. This kind of cosmopolitanism, and it's a great human invention because it holds the possibility of democracy and democratic values as key to solving problems. And I think one of the great tragedies of 21st century multilateralism is that it's largely being captured by somewhat footloose firms at the expense of the nation state. I think that's the real problem when it comes to the Westphalian origins of all that. Takes you back into a debate in the 17th century that I don't think is relevant to the kind of struggles that we are facing today. But I do think this notion of the commons is actually between, if you like, the market and the state. The notion of the commons, I think, is a very important one for trying to understand certain types of dynamics that we get back. And my good good friend Guy Standing has written this book called The Plunder of the Commons, as the way in which the current system is essentially mining the commons for its own short-term gains, which I think is a very serious problem that needs to be addressed in this context. I guess impact investment. I would recommend everyone reads the book that you referred to by Girid Haradas, which is called "Winners Take All: The Elite Charade of Changing the World." And he's skeptical of ideas like impact investment and doing well by doing good and microfinance, which you might disagree with him. And it's a great read, and I think it's a very telling read about the discussion that we're having here.
Thank you.
One word on digitalization. I think that digitalization has great potential for relocalizing manufacturing, developing small, nimble, productive local plants that will put an end to these worldwide supply chains that we know of at this stage. So I think there is great potential here. And again, we are working with many firms who are looking at that. The minimum economies of scales to be the plant goes down because of digitalization. So we could have multi-local firms that would be very productive and that could change the rule. Now, on impact investing, this is where maybe we don't agree. Yeah, the book is a great read, but it's a bit too far on one side. I think what is going on, and again, this is why I am hoping to see, that the coronavirus is not going to make this scramble, but what we have seen is a significant change. Impact investing is a reality. It used to be something very, very marginal. Larry Fink and many people say, look, guys, you have to do it, and you don't have to do it to save the world. You have to do it to save the world, to save yourself, to save the financial system. And again, let's go back. It's because he's selfish that he's talking about saving the world. I have no sympathy for Larry Fink either, but he's very pragmatic. He says, hey, we need to save the world, and because we want to save our position, this guy is filthy rich, and he says one way to do it, practical, concretely, is to do more about impact investing and to look at the license to operate. Firms will not have license to operate if they don't behave the way they should behave, and the cost of the license to operate is going to increase, which I like very much. We'll see whether the coronavirus will be the end of it or not.
Okay, Richard, one word.
Just on digitalization. I agree. Its potential is amazing. The reality is a highly predatory world dominated by massive corporations that are rent-seeking to the nth degree. And so, yet the potential is there, as with many technologies. The reality in a hyper-globalized world is something, I think, very, very different.
But have you seen how now Uber model, Airbnb models are being challenged in the right way to say, look, they have to be paid fairly, they have to be compensated fairly, to the point where these models are jeopardized. So I think maybe the Uberization of the world was just a bubble, and I hope that this is going to be only a bubble, and a new model of digitalization may develop, very much so.
I mean, how did Uber survive? Uber has not made $1 of profit in its entire existence, but it's worth apparently billions of dollars, and its owner is worth. The rules of the game in that world are the problem, not the particular strategies that a firm or an individual who owns that firm are following. I think to me that's the key issue again. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So, other questions? One question here. You are Boris. But make it short, please.
That doesn't change the silliness of my question, by the way. Okay, Boris Engelson, journalist freelance. So you said that billionaires are arsonists, and I couldn't agree more. If you read the biography of Picasso or Karajan or Charlie Chaplin or Pulitzer, yes, Pulitzer was a special kind of bastard, I totally agree with you. My questions are the following. First, it's the first time that I attend a round table not to throw rotten tomatoes to billionaires because of the stinginess, but because of their generosity. Was it absolutely urgent in March 2020 to suddenly point at the generosity of billionaires as a major threat to humanity and civilization? And is the best way to demonstrate the capture of states by capitalism to hold ultra-leftist rhetorics in international organizations, that is interstate bodies, and everywhere all the time, because you are not the only one. I am accredited at the Palais des Nations, and I only hear socialite, progressive, and quite often extreme leftist talk from these organizations. So how can captured states talk leftist talk?
Thank you, Boris. I just want to underscore that IMD, for example, is not especially a Marxist-Leninist school, but I'll let that open to you. Okay, so yeah, things change. We have to adapt. We have to adapt. I'm sorry. So let's answer to these points. Somebody wants to react?
I don't consider the ideas of Adam Smith, Schumpeter or John Maynard Keynes to be extreme leftist.
And I
Wealth is power was Smith's phrase. Wealth. Read Adam Smith. Read The Wealth of Nations. You know, wealth is power.
And I don't think we throw tomatoes to billionaires. I think we have to take it with a grain of salt. We need to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And again, realpolitik here is very important, I think.
And if I may add, I think there is no time to, good or bad time to talk about these subjects. It's an important subject, and I think it's the very right time to talk about it, but anybody can have another idea, for sure. Thank you for your question. And are there other questions? Other questions? No other questions. Have you another question?
Was Messen a person? I think that...
Okay, one last one. Yeah.
I think that the French word mécénat comes from the name of a person. I am not sure. Should we? He was one of these people who wanted to pass to history. He has been glorious for history for 2,000 years. Should we change this name for synonym in the dictionary?
No, this is evertegism. You know, this has been existing in the Greek, in Rome. People were making large contributions to cities and to the empire just because they wanted their name to be remembered. So that's what it is, not less, not more.
They were quite often former slaves.
No, it has been the case, but these were more the Romans who had been amassing a lot of wealth, and they wanted to show their wealth. It's the mansions in Rhode Island all over again. That's what it is. So yes, let's take it. Thank you very much. By the way, they don't like modern art, which is great, because our billionaires in France, they invest in modern art. And to be honest, I prefer the billionaires to invest in, even Bezos, you know, to give 10 billion to the Earth Fund than our billionaires in France who invest in modern art.
Richard, one word?
Well, let me just recall another extreme leftist who operated at the multilateral level, Henry Morgenthau, the US Secretary of the Treasury, who was responsible for creating multilateralism in 1944 at Bretton Woods. And Morgenthau had a very clear understanding of what healthy multilateralism was all about. He had three things that you needed in this extreme leftist position. the first thing you have to do to have healthy multilateralism is to be able to control footloose capital. Because if you allow capital to trip around the world doing what it wants, how it wants, where it wants, when it wants, then you will get a highly unbalanced, highly unequal and destructive global economy. That was Morgenthau. Second thing that Morgenthau wanted to promote, and this is what he said when he defended the Bretton Woods agreement at the Banking and Currency Committee in the US Congress in 1945. The second thing he wanted was to ensure that all governments had the necessary policy space to be able to respond to the demands of their citizens. So he wanted to control footloose capital, and he wanted governments to have enough policy space to do the right thing by their population. And the third thing he wanted as a healthy multilateralism was to be able to control what he called economic bullying by the strong guys in the global economy against the weak and the vulnerable participants in the global economy. The great tragedy of contemporary multilateralism is not that it's gone extreme leftist, that it's abandoned the principles of the US Secretary of State in 1944, 1945. That's the great tragedy of contemporary multilateralism.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, Frédéric. I really appreciate it. It was a very interesting debate. Thank you to you all. I think we talked a lot more than about billionaires. We talked about the system, how it can evolve, and especially how we can manage to struggle against climate change. So thank you to all, and we will repeat that in the next times from month to month, and you're all welcome here. Have a good day. And thank you to all those who are following us on TV, on webcast at our session at the Geneva Press